Gentlemen, let's just cover a bit of breaking news. The Foreign Minister, Bob Carr, wanted his department to look into what the Department of Foreign Affairs had done for Ben Ziggia, the man who died in Israeli jail in 2010. Now, Mark Dreyfus has a significant role within the intelligence agencies himself as Attorney General. What can you... I know you've been travelling today. What can you tell us about what that report says?
I can say that the Foreign Minister held a press conference this afternoon at which he was discussing the review that he's released, that he'd said a couple of weeks back he'd requested occur into his department. He was interested in the consular processes that had been followed by DFAT during the course of detention of Mr Ziggia in an Israeli prison. And he's pointed in the report to some suggestions in this very unusual case of what protocols might be employed in future by consular officials, by the Department of Foreign Affairs in dealing with such a case.
How does it work? Because I've had a look at some of his comments. He's saying that Mr Ziggia wasn't visited enough by consular officials. I mean, I know you're not the Foreign Minister, but does someone need to ask the consular staff to go?
The other point that he made is that Mr Ziggia was visited very, very frequently by members of his family, both from Australia and his family in Israel, and there was no suggestion by the family that more needed to be done by the Department of Foreign Affairs or consular officials in Israel. The other point that the Foreign Minister made clear, and I can make clear as well, is that, as I said some weeks ago, there is no need for any further review. There's certainly no need for a review to be conducted in the Attorney General's Department. And as also the Foreign Minister said in his press conference, the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security has released a statement saying that she did not propose to conduct any review of ASIO because none was called for.
The Inspector General is kind of like the Ombudsman of the intelligence services. It's coming up to 21 minutes to 5 o'clock on 774 ABC Melbourne. Mr Dreyfus, Kevin Andrews, I don't presume you need to add anything there on
No, I think it's appropriate that there was an inquiry. Obviously there was some miscommunications. I think that's what's come out of that inquiry, and we need to learn from that.
Okay. And I'd perhaps add again that I extend the sympathies of the Australian government in what is a tragic case to the family of Ben Ziggia.
Let's talk about the legislation. I mentioned Julia Gillard spending much, if not most, of her week in Western Sydney. You, Mark Dreyfus, want to in some way have national laws to deal with gangs. It's never clear to me, and to be honest, it makes me very uncomfortable when federal politicians talk about state policing issues. Why do we even need national laws to deal with gangs?
The Australian Federal Police have made this suggestion to us, and they, of course, in addition to their role in enforcing Commonwealth law, have got coordination roles, and they work with state police forces. I think Australians expect to see our state police forces, our territory police forces, working with the Australian Federal Police, working together. And the point of national laws is simply this. Criminal gangs, any kind of organised crime, works across state, territory and national boundaries. And they don't respect those state, territory and national boundaries. They exploit gaps in the law. They exploit the fact that some states have got criminal organisation laws, others have got none at all. And what we're looking for is a national scheme so that those gaps can be closed.
But there's two issues, isn't there? One is you're asking state governments to give up some of their powers, and secondly, I'm always sceptical, as I said, of federal ability to influence policing issues. It sounds a bit too convenient to be making those announcements while Julia Gillard is trying to win votes in suburban Sydney. Well,
I can tell you that in both Sydney but also in Melbourne, there is some real concern about gang activity, and rightly, particularly in Sydney, there's been an extraordinary rise in the level of shootings, particularly this drive-by shooting phenomenon, where there's been some 80 such incidents over the last year, or a bit more than 80. There's tremendous concern in Sydney about why there is this prevalence of guns, and a concern that state and federal government should act together on this problem. And I'd say again, we're acting here in response to suggestions made by the Australian Federal Police and in response to suggestions made by a federal parliamentary committee.
Kevin Andrews, am I right to be sceptical?
Well, it's my observation over the years, Raf, that when governments are in trouble, they start to rattle the law and order can. I think it'd be more credible if the government hadn't cut $260 million from the federal police over 2 budgets and almost 100 personnel from the federal police. That's beside other cuts to the Australian Crime Commission. Yes, we want harmonisation, but it's interesting that so far the states seem to be saying we don't need this takeover of our powers.
Sorry to interrupt you there, Kevin Andrews, part of Tony Abbott's team. It's a good idea, though, isn't it, if you are able to effectively prescribe, say, an outlaw motorcycle gang, and you can do that. The Australian Federal Police want to be able to do it across the country without bothering different state police forces and different parliaments. That's a good idea, isn't it?
It's a good idea to have harmony so far as the laws are concerned about these things. There is already cooperation between various police forces, and the Australian Crime Commission is probably the best example of cooperation where essentially a federal body can co-opt police from the various states to be part of those investigations and exercises. So I think there is a level of cooperation there, whether you need the federal police to take over various areas that have traditionally been state responsibility. If you can harmonise your laws and cooperate together, then you don't need a federal takeover.
Can we just fact-check the AFP budget cut? I don't know if you know the figures, Mark Dreyfus. Someone's texted to say, in fact, that the AFP budget has increased $300 million under Labor. I have no idea. Kevin Andrews, I think, what did you say the budget cut
my
was?
figures are in 2011-12 was $131.5 million cut
to the
and
AFP.
In 2012-13, another $133 million.
Mark?
And I'd have to check on the exact figures. I do know that we've got more than 6,000 employees in the Australian Federal Police, and another of the announcements that the Prime Minister made back on Sunday with Jason Clare, the Justice Minister, was something that will in effect be an increase in staffing for the Australian Federal Police, which is this National Gangs Task Force.
Sure.
There's some additional 70 or 80 AFP officers proposed with that.
Look, I do want to move on to the 457 visa issue, but I'll ask you both to give me a very brief response. Does anybody actually bring up the issue of gangs when federal MPs go door knocking? Kevin Andrews, is it something?
No, it's not something that happens in my electorate now. But I would say that there are certain areas in which there is a greater prevalence of crime than others.
Understood.
But no, it's not something that people
Mark
raise
Dreyfus,
with me.
do people raise it with federal MPs?
I have had it raised with me.
Unprompted?
Perhaps I'm in some unprompted. That's perhaps because I'm in a slightly different part of Melbourne than Kevin. But I can say at Punch Bowl today in Sydney with the Prime Minister and in Tony Burke, in whose electorate it is, there is a very large level of concern about drive-by shootings. That is gang activity, and there was a shooting just last night in southwest Sydney.
Sure. Look, let me ask you about the 457 visas, Mark Dreyfus. The government was very upset last week with the opposition for their comments they made about asylum seekers. Just seems a bit odd to me. The 457 visas, there aren't really that many of them. It's quite a small number of the workforce. I think it's about 0.8% of the workforce, something like that. And the number of incidents, so the times that employers or people who come here to work from overseas actually breach their conditions seems to be a fairly small number. Why is the Prime Minister talking, I think this is the quote, we need to stop foreign workers being part of the front of the queue with Australian workers at the back? Why is the Prime Minister making this such an issue when there doesn't seem to be that much rule breaking?
Well, I don't think that's right, Raf. It was the Herald Sun today had some statistics from the department indicating some 50 prosecutions, about 500 warnings given to employers.
There's like 80,000 people or 100,000 people.
Well, I actually regard that as substantial, and there are sufficient number of cases that have been reported, sufficient number of warnings given that we think, very right to be concerned about it. This is a program that is intended to fill gaps where Australian workers cannot provide the skills that are needed, and it's all it is. It's not an excuse for stripping conditions away, for bringing people here on low wages.
49. I think this is out of the Herald. So the 49 employers fined, 449 given warnings. It's tiny out of 100,000 people, isn't it?
Well, it's still a great concern, and we're right to draw attention to it, because this is a misuse of a program. If it is occurring, it shouldn't be occurring at all, and it's a real concern that the Liberal Party says that they want this program to be a mainstay of employment under their immigration program.
Kevin Andrews, is there a substantial problem with these
visas?
No,
there's not. I mean, the numbers are piddling. And in fact, the number of 457 visas in Australia has increased under this government. But let's go back to basic principles here. When I was the Employment Minister in 2004, we had a study done by Monash University that showed that the growth in the workforce in Australia then was about 175,000 people per year. It also estimated, because of the demographic trends, that the growth for the entire decade from 2020 to 2030 would be about 12,000 people. So if we don't have workers coming in from overseas, then we simply will not be able to sustain the economy in Australia. So this is an important program. We shouldn't be demonising this program. If there are employers or employees or anybody else who breaks the law, well then the law should apply to them. But that's not a reason to demonise a program which is really crucial to the economic future of Australia.
And we're not demonising the program, Raf. This is a program that will be needed. We know that there are skill shortages in parts of the country. If you've
got a small number of infringements and you're talking about foreign workers being at the front of the queue, that is demonising them, isn't it?
We're right to be concerned about misuse of this program. We're right to be saying we put Aussie jobs.
With us on Fight Club is Mark Dreyfus. He's the Attorney General in Julia Gillard's cabinet, and Kevin Andrews is the Shadow Minister for Families, Housing and Human Services. He is, of course, part of Tony Abbott's shadow cabinet. 1300 222 774 if you've got a query to put to them both. Why don't I start with you, Kevin Andrews? Seems to me very unclear. There's a package of money people receive as compensation for carbon pricing. I don't actually know if the opposition are going to continue to give out that carbon compensation or not.
Well, our starting point, Raf, is this. If you don't have a carbon tax, then you don't need compensation.
Yes.
And remember, the government...
you don't want to give people a tax rise. So are we... Look, we all know the Coalition's position on carbon pricing, well versed. We all understand. Is the money that people receive going to be there if the Coalition wins after September?
Well, we have to go back to basics here. We don't know what money is there in the first place. There's a budget which is to be delivered by, presumably, Mr Swan in May.
Yeah.
And then there is a statement which comes from not the government but the Secretary of the Treasury 10 days into the election campaign, which lays bare the actual state of the finances. Anybody who would pretend to know what the state of the finances are under this government before that statement from the Treasury is unlikely to be...
It hasn't stopped you. You're going to scrap the school kids bonus. You're going to get rid of carbon pricing. You're going to get rid of the mining tax. You are going to impose a tax on big companies for the fathers.
A levy for the paid parental leave.
Parental leave. So you've been able to say all of those things. Why can't you say if that package of money, which can be significant for some people, I think it's sort of $500, $600, $700 depending on your means. Why can't you say if that will stay or not?
Well, because we simply don't know the state of the books. We've been promised surpluses in the past, and now they're turning into deficits. We've got $170 billion worth of combined
you're
deficits.
Talking about the government that in the past it's been the carbon tax will go, the compensation will go. Why is the Coalition now getting cold feet on that?
No, we're not getting cold feet. We're simply being realistic. It would be irresponsible for us to say to the Australian people, we can foreshadow what the state of the books will be in 2 months' time at the budget, let alone in almost 6 months' time when we get to the election campaign. We don't know. I suspect the government doesn't know itself at this stage. And when we do know, then we can confidently go to the Australian people saying, this is the basis upon which we make our promises, and you can judge them then.
Mark Dreyfus?
And I know that we've got a carefully designed carbon price scheme that is delivering assistance to low and middle income Australians. And I can understand Kevin's desperation here, Rav. He's got a leader who has said they're going to scrap the carbon price scheme. He's got a shadow treasurer who is out there saying that he's not making any promises at all about anything. And for the moment, I'm going to rely on what Tony Abbott said, which is that he's going to scrap the carbon price, and with it, he's going to scrap the tax cuts. He's going to scrap the assistance for pensioners and students, and all of the other benefits, the family benefits that go with the carbon price scheme.
I mean, they do have a valid point, regardless of whether or not you support carbon pricing or not. If that imposition is no longer there, a government doesn't need to provide that compensation. I mean, that's a very logical position, isn't it?
Well, that's why we need to know what is Tony Abbott's position. He says that the tax cuts are going to stay in the next breath, and as you've just pointed out, he's actually said, contrary to the no promises from Joe Hockey, that he's going to scrap the school kids bonus, and he's going to scrap something you mentioned, omitted to mention, the low income superannuation supplement, which actually delivers superannuation benefits to some 3.2 million
Which
Australians, most of them women.
Wasn't that going to be funded by a mining tax that hasn't raised enough money?
Well, but it's in place. That's the point.
Still a difficulty for you. Look, I want to get on to a call, Marion's call from Mentone, with a question I think that's probably on lots of people's minds. Marion, both of the gentlemen can hear you. What's your query?
Hi. Look, I want some concrete concepts from both of the politicians, from both of the parties, about what they are going to do to improve the integrity and the behaviour of politicians. I have two late teenage children who are just starting to get engaged in political discussions, and they are so disillusioned about what is going on and whether we can actually believe anything we hear from our politicians. So what's going to be done by the major parties to address this lack of confidence in people who we should be able to trust?
Mark?
Well, Marion, you may well be in my electorate if you're from Mentone, or you might be in Andrew Robbs, so nice to hear from you. And I'm sorry if this sounds partisan, I'm very concerned about the way politics has been conducted in Australia since the last election, starting with Tony Abbott saying that the government hadn't been legitimately formed, and going on with basically shouting slogans for the next 2.5 years, including massive misrepresentations about pricing carbon. Now, that's no way to conduct a debate about the very important policy area of taking action on climate change. And it has been, as someone that's been involved in the design of the carbon price scheme, I can say it has been very difficult to have to put up with this continued shouting of slogans and misrepresentation about pricing carbon, which international financial organisations around the world, the IMF, the World Bank, OECD,
I'm not
and
sure
other
you're really
countries.
answering a question, though, about improving integrity.
Well, I'm giving an example here, Raf, that I'm doing it so in a partisan way. I accept that because this is the policy area I have worked in up until a month ago when I became Attorney General. Certainly, I try to talk about policy. I got into politics to talk about policy, and I'm very happy at any point to have a discussion about any aspect of Labor policy or the government's policy.
Kevin?
Well, coming from a man whose leader said there'll be no carbon tax under the government I lead and then introduced one, I don't think there's much basis to talk about trust. But generally on the question of the integrity of politicians, look, frankly, I think it's up to all of us. It's up to me, it's up to Mark, it's up to everybody in the Parliament to try and raise the standards. Now, it's a hothouse sometimes. I've been there for 22 years and it's been the same at various times over those 2 decades. It's better that than us fighting in the streets as they do in some countries.
Okay, look, I'm not sure that's answered Marion's query or not. I want to ask you both, though, a very local question. The trouble that Ted Baillie's government is in, regardless of whether or not that is enduring, do these issues potentially impact on the federal election in September 1? I'll start with you, Kevin Andrews.
Look, I think most Australians make a division between federal and state politics. They clearly do that. Parties have problems from time to time, but for him, he's a long way out from an election.
I agree with Kevin that there's a distinction drawn between state and federal politics, but I think there's one very clear thing that you can draw from the Baillieu government, which is a preparedness to cut services. And you'll be hearing me say more about this because I think an Abbott government would be exactly the same, prepared to cut services.
Okay, look,
Far from it, can I say, Raf?
Okay, I'm going to need to leave it there. Thank you, gentlemen, both for coming in. Appreciate you taking the time. Kevin Andrews is the Shadow Minister for Families, Housing and Human Services, and Mark Dreyfus QC is the Attorney General. Let's find out if the weather's going to change. I don't think it is. Peter Newham joins us from the Bureau. Hi there, Peter.
Hi, Raf.
A little bit hotter tomorrow or a little bit cooler?
Oh, much the same. It got to 33.5 today, and that's the third day in a row about that temperature, and we're forecasting 33 tomorrow, so pretty much a replica. I think there'll be a bit more cloud around. There's been northerly winds in the morning, but we should tomorrow at least see some sea breezes, southerlies develop in the afternoon, which haven't really developed today. So that'll hopefully take the edge off the temperature a bit later tomorrow evening. But basically, partly cloudy day. It should remain dry, and yeah, as I said, a maximum of 33 after a fairly mild night of 22. And really, there's no change expected over the next week. It's going to remain pretty hot. Most nights we'll see temperatures drop to between about 19 and 21 degrees, and maximum temperatures likely to hover in the low to mid 30s. There's a chance of isolated showers, particularly in outer suburbs, on both Friday and Saturday, but I don't think we'll see much. And then it'll be dry for Sunday, Monday and Tuesday. And at this stage it looks like it'll be be particularly hot on Tuesday and Wednesday, getting into the mid to high 30s, and a cool change probably coming later on Wednesday. So that's that'll be the relief from the heat coming later Wednesday, but basically in the low to mid 30s until then.
And we'll have to enjoy the heat while we can. Thanks, Peter.
Okay.
Peter Newham there at the Bureau. After the 5 o'clock news, the trouble continues for the Baillieu government. We have calls in to the Premier, his ministers. We're not sure if they will join us. They have told us they are onto it. The state opposition will join us, and we'll check in with the police investigating bikie crime and a potential war. Will it get any worse? And can they stop it?
The Baillieu government faces